What we're about, I've said yesterday about herbicides, we're using a fair bit of herbicide practice to solve other herbicide problems in the north, but we really need to push the non-chemical tactics. They're considered, as John Cameron would say, a free hit. He talks about the analogy of using a gun and you get so many shots with your herbicides. If we can at least incorporate strategies in the north which are long-lasting, which should perpetuate for many years, we should complement what other herbicides we still got in the northern region to get very good control of weeds. Three things at least I'd like to take home for everyone to, after this talk is, and we've heard this before, but we're trying to make it more applicable for the northern region, is that we get varietal differences with competitive ability. It's quite obvious, but we're just backing this up with data, so we'll have some examples. We're also looking at the competitiveness of high marsh scope and Granger can be improved just by increasing sowing rate. And that's been floated out before, the issues of sowing rate, row spacing, and furthermore, most importantly, is some work done on row orientation and trying to intercept as much of the solar radiation, particularly in the winter months when the sun's at a low angle. We're finding that we're getting some significant impacts on weed establishment and production by just going east-west versus a north-south orientation. A couple of shots, because this talk was given by Greg Brook recently down at Coonabarabran and Nyngan. And so I'll just put this in just to highlight their problems, but more importantly, there's nothing like a weed in a fallow. The seed production potential of a weed without any competition is very large relative to something that grows in a crop, and there's data out there depending on the crop, but you could get weeds, and this is just glyphosate-resistant annual ryegrass, typical patches around the Narromine district where we're seeing some ryegrass growing. Now, unabated, weeds in a fallow, seed production potential's huge. There's also data out there, and there's a wild radish, which is group I resistant in the Nyngan region. They've been using group Is or hormonals for 15, 20 years non-stop, and we're starting to get some radish coming through. So we need every bit of, every tool available, not just herbicides. Another important fact is that most of the weeds that grow at the same time as a crop, that emerge at the same time as a crop, probably produce close to 90% of the seed. So if we've got herbicides plus some other non-chemical strategy on top of that, we may have a pretty large impact on some of those weeds. Non-herbicide tactics. Row orientation, there's a lot of things to consider. As I said, to do experimental work on this, and I was talking to Chris Preston just before we came in, there's so many factors that you've got to take account of. You know, it's even your paddock, the paddock shape, the orientation, the slope of your paddock, the variety, that's row spacings, how many seeds per metre row, all those things have an impact. Here's an example of the sun in the winter solstice, pretty low on the horizon. You know, if you've got sun-loving plants, you don't plant them on the sort of the southeastern side of your house. You put them in the northeast or northwestern part of the house so they get the sun. They grow a lot happier. Same sort of philosophy is used in a crop where you've got the wheat. Hopefully, what we want to do is maximise the amount of sunlight on the wheat and minimise the amount of sunlight on the weed. So there you go. That's the angle of incidence. And in summer, which is clearly going to be higher up in the solar plane, which is usually about 80 or 90, close to 90 degrees, almost directly above your head. The data I'm showing you, because we've got a bit of data for the northwest, but we're going to make some inferences from research done by Catherine Borgia in Meriden. And if you look at the latitude and drag it across there, it's about south 31 degrees on the latitude. That sort of equates roughly to Tamworth or parts thereabouts. So some of the data in terms of the solar radiation and the incidence is applicable to some areas in the north of New South Wales. This is confirmed by climate and geoscience sites. where in this particular case we're looking Meridan's down here in the winter solstice. You've got the sun angle off the horizon only 33 degrees, so it's pretty low. And in summer, which is less relevant because we're not growing summer crops as much, 75 degrees. There seems to be a bit of a glitch here that in Goondiwindi in particular, in winter it's got a slightly higher angle because we're closer to the equator. But when, for some reason, that's 74, and I think that should be about 86 or 87 degrees, because you're closer to the equator, the sun should be a little bit higher. For some reason, that's what the website said. But there you go, all got similar amounts of solar radiation, so the data from Meridan should be applicable to here. Okay, percentage of light intercepted. So it's not just measuring crop effects, they've actually measured the amount of solar radiation that actually hits the ground. They use a septometer. There's wheat and barley. The black bar is east-west orientation. So you're getting at least 70% capture of the total solar radiation hitting the wheat, whereas you do a north-south, and you can imagine sort of around about midday or a couple of hours either side of midday, the sun's shooting right between the rows and just hitting the soil. So it's not very effective use of sunlight. So wheat's quite good, barley yet again not too bad. It's probably a little bit more aggressive, so it can, even if you sow a slightly, the north-south orientation, it's probably got a bit more foliage, so it captures a little bit more solar radiation, even if it's not very the desired outcome. Okay, and there's also work at Bithram here, which is near Tamworth, just west of Tamworth, by Matt Gardner, who I'm subbing in for. Subbing in twice, as been told. In this particular trial, 6 to 7% less. So in this trial, it wasn't significant. It wasn't actually beneficial to sow in an east-west orientation. Actually yield a little bit less. So you do get some anomalies. You do get some data where it doesn't go your way. But on the whole, you'll see some of the data later on that confirms better yield advantage and better weed suppression. When weeds were present, the yield gap between east and west closed. So in this particular trial, it wasn't a huge difference. The trial, I think they used canola as their substitute weed. And most importantly, even though there wasn't a yield benefit, there was a 30 to 40% yield suppression of canola as a substitute weed on an east-west sowing. If you sow, on top of that, if you sow a different variety, such as skipper, you'll get even more suppression of your weed. Now, this is sort of similar to the chemical paradigm where we love to add an adjuvant to get a little bit of extra control. Why don't we do the same using a crop? It's the same sort of philosophy. It just takes a little bit of effort to change things around. At Meridan in Western Australia, they've done a trial. They actually used, they didn't use mimic weeds. They had ryegrass and radish. The east-west sowing generally gave a 24% yield increase for the crop, and same sort of level in barley. But most importantly, the east-west orientation significantly gave a lower biomass of weed. Wasn't as strong in crops like lupins, canola, field peas and things like that. Just ignore this because it throws you out when you see wheat and barley kilograms per hectare. This is actually weed biomass, so we're hoping to get less weed biomass in this column compared to the north-south. And generally there's a huge trend to suggest that. Sometimes it may not be significant, but you can see sometimes it's halved, if not more than halved, the weed biomass in this particular case, and in the barley, yet again, you get quite significant reductions. And grain, in terms of yield for your crop, yet again, you get that slight advantage. So, you know, if we want to, the first talk in the plenary session yesterday talked about maximising our efficiency and our water use, and even things like this may tweak our system to get that better yield production. Okay, there's also the option of considering row spacing, and that's a thing that has been brought up in many in IWM talk. Some farmers are slowly but steadily tightening their rows. You've seen cases where you get a block tube in the combine, a block run, and you'll just get weeds come up and proliferate. We're trying to push row spacing down to 9 inches and from 15, if not tighter, if possible. So you have that on top of what I've just said, it can go a long way. We'll just go to the next slide. Here's the trials at Trangie Research Station, and this is a variety trial where they use different varieties of barley, and occasionally are used in some varieties different sowing rates. So you've got Hindmarsh there, 200 seeds per square metre, and Hindmarsh in the background you can see is looking a little bit thinner there, 100 seeds per square metre. You've got Scope, an IMI-tolerant barley type, Bass, Wimmera, looks like a poor performer in this trial. And they used oats, yarn oats, as a substitute weed, so it'll mimic wild oat plants. The data suggests that there's clearly a varietal difference in terms of competitive ability. This is the effect on yield initially. And at let's have a look here. We've got Granger at, well, it's a typo there, but that's Granger at the lower rate, 100, and Granger at 200. You don't get any yield penalty by upping the sowing rate. And yet again with Hindmarsh at 100 seeds per square metre and 200 seeds per square metre, you still get some yield advantage plus weed control. Even under some of and that's plus or minus weed pressure, and you still get, they're pretty robust sort of varieties. They're still yielding quite well despite some of the weed pressure there. And this is the suppression on yield at Trangie. You've got oat yield, which is, as I said, the yarn oats. Skipper not performing very well, but Granger or some of these other varieties, I think is about 80% suppression compared to some of the worst case scenarios. So basically, even though it's some simple data sets, it's food for thought, and it's probably opens the door for potential research in the future to get these sort of factors, how can I say, get reliable data sets for the north to show growers, give them confidence that if they want to go and try and suppress yield using a free hit, not pushing the herbicide resistance buttons, they can do it quite reliably, getting some moderate control. You're not going to get 99% control, but if I dare say, looking at some of the data sets, most of this trial work was done without much intervention of a herbicide. So if we integrate that with a herbicide, good herbicide practice, and we've heard talks from Chris Preston earlier yesterday to get the maximum effect on pre-emergent herbicides, and you overlay that with some good crop orientation sowing, hopefully in the long term we're going to have higher levels of weed control and hopefully put a cap on the ever unfortunately spreading herbicide resistance problems we have here in the north. So I'll leave it at that. There's a whole lot of people I'd like to acknowledge, and they're from not just our department in New South Wales, but also the Queenslanders, but also the Western Australian people. Thank you. Look, honestly, if you have a dry year, most likely you're going to have it negated by just drought effects or poor vigour, crop vigour. I dare say that obviously in a very good year, if you get your crop up, I know the weeds will come up, but if you've got that slight competitive advantage in a good year, I think the crop will get away more than the weed. I've seen it in many a case where I've seen crops that are almost set to fail and either baled or harvested. You just see wheat and then weeds just as prolific as a crop, and the drought effects take over, obviously. So we do need reliability over at least 2 or 3 variable seasons, different seasons, to see how reliable it is.
Cookie, with that east-west row orientation, do you have any understanding of where that runs out as we move further north? My understanding was about here is about the limit, and once you're going further north, it really doesn't matter which way they go, but do you have any comment to make on that one?
It's sort of, yeah, you're right, you get less and less effect as you go further north or as you push into spring and summer.
Yep.
But you can still push the system by adjusting maybe taller varieties to make the most of that thing. So
that all works. Just
yeah, so you can push those boundaries a bit further north by pushing the system, putting more wheat, using a pre-emergent herbicide. There's a lot to be gleaned or learnt from this information, just as a start. But you know, as I said, I was talking to someone outside this morning. I said some of the weeds that are tall, such as wild oats, may grow with the crop and compete for light. But some of the rosette weeds that are smaller and stay on the ground. Michael Widerick said yesterday, south thistle and fleabane are pathetic competitors because they're a rosette weed and they're on the ground, so they don't get that height differential. So there's all that sort of stuff that we could look at and get information on.